I'm going to introduce Tamara, and it's pronounced Hartl?
Hartl, it's Tamara.
Tamara
Hartl. Tamara Hartl.
Tamara Hartl.
Yes.
Okay. So, with great pleasure, let me introduce Tamara Hartl.
I got called to the office one time and they called me tomorrow, and I heard about that for a long time because they all thought I was in trouble. So, and I had it marked in there. Okay. This is my short story, The Lady's Prophet. There's a light in the shadow. I was just passing by the saloon when her singing caught my attention. I peeked in the open doorway. The woman had a respectable voice, but she was a soiled dove, just past her prime. Still, I noted her countenance and was suddenly struck with an idea that thundered into my imagination. She is going to help me rob the local bank. All I had to figure out was how I was going to get her to agree. I got my chance late that night after spending several hours lurking in the alleyway behind the saloon. Lurking was not an action I had ever thought I would be reduced to, but my circumstances put me into a position where I was ready to do a lot worse than lurk. A boy, around 12 or so, appeared from a back door with a pail of dirty wash water. I spooked him with a psst to get his attention. Psst, I hissed again. He looked at me with a rather comical expression. "Ma'am," he squeaked in surprise, "what in tarnation are you hiding back here?" I moved out of the shadows. "How would you like to make a penny?" I asked him. The boy looked at me with suspicion as he brushed a lock of lank brown hair out of his eyes. "What do you want?" I moved closer, almost into the pool of light that escaped the open door and smoothed the skirt of my heavy widow's weeds. "I just need to speak to someone inside. Could you get her for me?" He took a step back, looking ready to bolt. "Who do you want to talk to? Most of the gals here are busy right now. They get real testy at being interrupted." "The lady who was singing earlier, is she busy?" I asked and took a last step into the light. "I'll give you 2 pennies if you'll just get her to come down to talk to me." The boy gave a little gasp. "Wow, ma'am, you're a looker, begging your pardon for saying so." I gave a snort of disgust. Men, even at a tender age, just couldn't see past the outer package. "Please," I begged, "I really need to speak to her." He held out a dirty hand. "I'll go see, but I ain't promising Sarah will come down." I dropped the pennies into his palm. "Thank you. All I can ask is that you try." 10 minutes later, the woman I sought came out the back door. Minus the heavy makeup and the hideous scarlet dress she had been stuffed into, she was rather pretty. Faded blue eyes stared back at me as she pulled her long braid of chestnut hair over her shoulder. "Jeb said you were looking for me," she grumbled and took a look over her shoulder. "I could get in a lot of trouble with my boss talking to you. What do you want, lady?" Sarah had the hard look about her a woman in her profession tended to carry. I've seen it before. Most would do just about anything to better their lives, especially if they worked in harsh conditions. From her nervous glances over her shoulder, a tough boss, no doubt, ran this establishment. If I was wrong about her, then I would have to make haste out of town. "Close the door and I'll tell you what I have in mind," I told her. "I'm looking for a partner and I think you're the one who can help me," I began, tucking a wayward strand of black hair behind my ear. Sarah pulled her threadbare robe closer over full breast. I was pretty sure that was all she was wearing. "What's your name, lady?" she asked, looking me up and down. "Maddie." "That's it, just Maddie?" She looked inside once more and closed the door, then sat on the top step. "That's it, until I'm leaving this piss-poor excuse of a town," I answered, still standing in front of her. I proceeded to tell her how I'd met my husband in New Orleans and had fallen very much in love with him. I let him talk me into moving. I left the city of my birth to come live on a small ranch, which is wedged smack in between 2 of the largest ranches in the area. He left me almost as soon as I had set my bags down on the dusty parlor floor to go fight for the Confederates. Not long after that, he got himself killed by some Yankee. I tried to keep things running smoothly, but the only hands left at the ranch were old men, and they were soon run off by the neighboring ranchers. One of them did offer to buy the place, which I assumed would be worth some decent money, but I was just a stupid female, right? I wasn't supposed to know anything about these sorts of things. So I was offered an insulting amount of money, among other things. Sarah understood my sarcasm. "What about going to the bank?" she questioned. I was going to do just that, but the bank president expected me to give it to him for next to nothing, and then he had the nerve to offer to let me to continue to live out there in exchange for certain favors. Sarah snorted at that. He comes in here all the time. He's a pig. I laughed quietly at that and then told Sarah the plan that had come to me that afternoon. First, her mouth fell open, and then she closed it as a smile slowly bloomed. What's in it for me? Partners, 50-50, I answered. Sarah stood up and took my hand. We shook. It's a deal. After a few last words, I left her as I went back into the dark alley to find my horse. In 3 days' time, our scheme went into action. Most ranch women know how to handle a pistol, rifle, or shotgun. Between the many varmints which might want to eat your favorite hen or take a calf that might one day feed your family, or even the worse, a human varmint, it's a necessity. Menfolk are always off doing something that leaves us at the homestead alone to defend it and ourselves. I had learned to handle a revolver before I had met my dear departed spouse. I was a pretty fair hand with a knife as well. I hadn't bothered to fill him in on the extent of my knowledge. Now the bank president would discover my prowess. I had not realized how much I would enjoy watching the sweat roll down his face and disappear into the fat rolls around his neck. I almost thought of telling him who it was that held the colt that poked him in his big paunch, especially after he had taken the liberty of groping my person the last time he had come by the ranch to persuade me to let him take it over. Years ago, I had learned how to apply heavy stage makeup from a passing acquaintance. I knew how to change my appearance completely. A gray-haired, stooped man stood in front of the bank president. I had watched him in the past few days and knew that he arrived much earlier than the other bank employees. No one paid any attention to an apparently drunk man who staggered into the alley behind the bank, out of sight, out of mind. It had been easy to blend into the shadows until the banker unlocked the back door. Now at gunpoint, he was filling a burlap sack with greenbacks. Greenbacks that had just recently been deposited by the neighboring ranchers after successfully selling their herds. Bless their generous souls. I doubt it, however, they would appreciate the irony. I made the quivering man lay on the floor and tucked my pistol in my belt. As I was tying his hands behind his back, he moved as if to resist. Don't, I commanded in a low growling voice as I drew my pistol again and shoved it none too gently into his ear. I gagged him tightly after tying his feet and then left the same way I had entered. I tossed the sack nonchalantly over my shoulder and resumed my drunken-appearing stagger through the back alleys. I made it to the saloon's back door and tapped lightly on the door. It quickly opened, and Sarah stared at me. She looked over my head both directions. I'm sorry, mister, but you gotta be moving on, she ordered, looking down the alley with some concern. Sarah, it's Maddie, I hissed under my breath. She looked at me in surprise. Damn, Maddie, she whispered back as she moved and let me in. Leading the way, she snuck me into the heart of the brothel and took me down a hallway and then upstairs to her own room. Once safely inside with the door locked, I took off the battered hat I wore and gave it a toss. It landed in a chair in one corner of the room. I grabbed a rag and dipped it into a basin of water on a table and began to scrub at the makeup on my face. Sarah opened up the top of the sack and peered inside. She covered her mouth with one hand and looked up at me. Surprise and then joy crossed her face. Oh my God, she exclaimed with a subdued squeal. Oh my God. I grinned back as I took the pins out of my hair. It fell to my waist with a puff of powder. I grabbed a hairbrush out of the valise I had left with Sarah the night before and began to hurriedly brush the rest of the concealing powder from my hair. Seeing my haste, Sarah closed the sack and helped me transform myself back into the helpless widow. After twisting my hair into a neat chignon, I donned my black bonnet. How do I look? I asked Sarah. She adjusted the bow under my chin. Beautiful, she said, and gave me a wink. What a change from your ruffian friend. We shared a chuckle, and I left to put on Act 2 of my plan. I trusted Sarah to carry out her part and not leave me, taking the money with her. She knew all I had to say was I'd seen her do it. She was the evidence. She had the evidence, after all. There was quite a bit of commotion in front of the bank when I entered. I spotted the bank president seated and talking animatedly with the sheriff. I took a calming breath and approached the banker. Excuse me, gentlemen, I interrupted, using my most alluring voice. I hoped I could maintain the helpless female air as I looked at the fat banker. It had felt really good to have him at gunpoint earlier. Ma'am, the sheriff said in greeting, touching his hat brim. Sheriff. I returned. "I hope I haven't come at an inconvenient time." The banker cleared his throat. I knew that he wouldn't be sharing the early morning events with me, so I got right to it while I watched him squirm a bit. I pulled a letter from my reticule and I handed it to him. "I have decided to run to my mother's hometown. With Wiley gone, I find that I am terribly lonely and wish to return to my family. This is a letter from my attorney. He will be handling the sale of my husband's property and will be running the proceeds through your bank. We have agreed on a sum that is a fair value for the ranch." The banker opened the letter while the sheriff looked on in curiosity. I felt it would benefit me even more to have a witness to the letter of which the attorney had a copy. The visit to him had been the reason I had been in town the other day. The banker looked up at me, his morning shock still reflected in his eyes. "This is a lot of money, ma'am." I agree, but my attorney assured me the land and what cattle are still there have that much value. Enclosed is an address where the funds may be wired once the sale occurs. I blinked once, coyly. The banker gave a barely perceivable shake and then seemed to deflate. "Of course, ma'am. Our bank would be happy to handle this for you." I gave him a rather blank smile. "Thank you," I replied, knowing I probably wouldn't see any money in the near future. "Gentlemen," I added to each man, "have a nice day." I turned and made my way from the bank and down the street to the train station. I had left what little belongings I had there, except for what I had needed at Sarah's. 2 hours later, I sat across from Sarah on a train bound for New Orleans. She was dressed in a very conservative blue dress and was looking both pretty and calm. She gave a pat to her upswept hair. "So, Maddie," she began, "now that we've left that piss-poor excuse of a town, I think I can ask you a few questions. After all, we're partners now." I lifted a brow at her in amusement, laughing softly under my breath. "Oh? Yeah, you got to spill it now, Maddie." I leaned back against my seat as the train rocked. "Ask away." "Your name, your full name," Sarah said. "Magdalene Aura Reddick Smith," I answered. I could see the wheels begin to turn in Sarah's mind. There was an Aura Reddick in New Orleans before the war. Any girl who works on her back has heard of her. She had the best whorehouse in New Orleans, and that is the rumor. Sarah pinned me with a considering look. "You're too young to be her." I gave her a smug smile. "Aura was my mother. I met my husband there while I was, shall we say, entertaining. He quite swept me off my feet." Sarah gave a bark of laughter, causing several heads to turn. Once outside attention desisted, she continued, "Well, I'll be damned. You do have a Frenchy look to you. So why are you going back to your ma's gone? Back if your ma's gone?" "I'm going to rebuild the business and make it even better," I answered. "What about you? What do you plan on doing with your share?" Sarah's eyebrows drew together as she sat thoughtfully for a minute. "You know what I would really like to do?" I shook my head. "I want to open up my own dress shop. The girls always came to me to make them something fancy. I would get these ladies' magazines every once in a while and make them copies of the dresses in there. Of course, I'd have to alter them a bit so the men could see what they wanted." She snorted at that thought. "Well, what I don't understand, though, is why you didn't want to stay at your man's place," Sarah added. "Stay respectable." "I guess I could have made it work," I said, "and settled myself more comfortably, but for one thing." Sarah looked at me quizzically. "What's that?" "I truly hate cows."
Any questions?
What was the inspiration?
I love Westerns, and I like bad girls. And I thought it would be fun to make a character that could be bad in several different ways, so it could be kind of fun too, and kind of fit in and then surprise people, with that underside to her. She just, I don't know. And she was also, as I was developing a character for this book, when I develop my characters, I like to really think about what they would be like as a real person and maybe what would make them the way they are. And I have a really feisty character in here. And as I was thinking about her, it was like, she's got to have an ancestor that is what makes her the way she is. And so that's where this woman came from, was her grandmother, or multiple great-grandmother.
Yeah, I just had a question. So you wrote this as a Western genre, but your book is fantasy, and so what do you see as the similarities or in crossing the genres?
Well, there have to be, the characters have to be able to be, self-preservation, and be able to fight for what they think that, to achieve what they need. However they have to get to it was one way. But I'm a Western junkie.
It's nice to see the Western genre again. We don't get to do that.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We're going to take another break, and then our last reader, Marla, will be reading, and she'll also be introducing her partner.